The Sopranos is often remembered as one of the greatest television dramas ever made, but the show becomes even more fascinating when you start looking at what is happening underneath the main story. David Chase and his writers constantly planted visual clues, recurring symbols, real-life references, foreshadowing, and details that only become obvious after you already know how the story ends. Some of these details are connected to real organized crime in New Jersey. Others are hidden in the production design, character behavior, music, locations, and even seemingly meaningless objects in the background. And then there are details that completely change the way you understand certain characters. So here are 20 dark details they hid in plain sight. One of the biggest misconceptions about The Sopranos is that Tony Soprano was simply a fictional version of one particular New Jersey gangster. In reality, David Chase and his writers drew from several real people, real criminal families, and Chase's own experiences growing up around Italian-American culture in New Jersey and New York. The show has often been associated with the De Cavalcante crime family, while other comparisons have been made to figures such as Vincent Vinny Ocean Palermo and members of the Boyardo organization. The important point is that Tony was never intended to be a perfect copy of one real person. He is a composite character built from different aspects of the New Jersey criminal world. That makes Tony much more interesting because the show isn't trying to tell the story of one gangster. It is trying to show what life inside that world could look like from the inside, including the contradictions that would normally be removed from a traditional mafia movie. Tony can be violent and manipulative one moment, and genuinely affectionate toward his children the next. He can order a murder and then become emotionally devastated by something happening to an animal. He can complain about his mother while simultaneously being terrified of losing her approval. That contradiction was one of the things that made The Sopranos different from earlier gangster stories. Tony isn't presented as a mythological crime boss. He's presented as a deeply damaged human being who happens to be a crime boss. The real-life inspiration, therefore, isn't just about copying names or criminal events. It's about creating a believable psychological portrait of the kind of person who could exist inside that world. When Tony first begins therapy, one of the most memorable details is his obsession with the family of ducks living in his swimming pool. At first, the ducks seem like a strange little comedic element designed to make Tony's panic attacks more unusual, but they are actually one of the most important symbols in the entire series. Tony becomes emotionally attached to the ducks because, in his mind, they represent something he desperately wants to protect: his family. He watches the mother and ducklings moving around his property, and their presence gives him a sense of comfort. When they eventually fly away, Tony experiences an emotional reaction that is much stronger than you would expect from an ordinary backyard animal. The reason is that Tony's greatest fear is not really death, it is abandonment and loss. He spends the entire series trying to convince himself that he is the powerful person controlling everyone around him, but underneath that image is someone terrified that the people he loves will disappear. His panic attacks are therefore connected to the possibility that he cannot protect his family. The ducks establish this theme almost immediately. Tony's entire criminal life is built around control, but the ducks remind him that the things he loves cannot actually be controlled. They can simply leave whenever they want, and that idea follows him throughout the entire series. People leave him. People betray him. People die. His family changes. His relationships collapse. Tony can threaten almost anyone in New Jersey, but he cannot force life to stay exactly the way he wants it to. The Bada Bing looks like one of those fictional locations that exist only inside the world of the show, but the exterior and interior locations used for the famous strip club were actually filmed at a real New Jersey club called Satin Dolls in Lodi. This wasn't a studio recreation that simply looked realistic. The production used the actual location extensively, which is one reason the Bada Bing feels so authentic. The bar, dance floor, poles, entrances, and general layout became permanently associated with Tony and his crew. What's particularly interesting is that the real club became so closely connected with the series that fans began visiting specifically because of The Sopranos. After the show ended, Pieces of the set and recognizable objects associated with the production were even sold or auctioned. The club had effectively become a piece of television history. There's also a small detail in the name itself that many viewers don't think about. Bada Bing is strongly associated with the language of classic gangster movies, particularly The Godfather, where Sonny Corleone uses the expression. That means even the name of Tony's headquarters connects The Sopranos to the gangster cinema that came before it. So every time Tony sits in that office discussing murders, money, betrayals, and business, you're watching a fictional crime organization operating inside a real New Jersey location that became one of the most recognizable places in television. One of the cleverest things about The Sopranos is that danger is often placed in the background instead of being announced directly. Tony can be sitting at dinner, walking into a store, visiting a restaurant, or talking to his family, and the show may quietly introduce someone who could potentially be a threat. This becomes especially important in the final season. The series increasingly makes ordinary environments feel dangerous because Tony has spent years creating enemies. Restaurants, parking lots, sidewalks, cars, and even family gatherings can become potential crime scenes. The finale takes this idea to its extreme. Tony sits in Holsten's waiting for his family, and several strangers enter the restaurant. One of them, wearing a members-only jacket, repeatedly attracts Tony's attention. The camera keeps showing Tony looking toward the entrance, while Meadows struggles to park outside. Nothing explicitly tells the audience what is going to happen. Instead, the show creates a feeling of permanent vulnerability. Tony has spent 6 seasons living as though death could come from anywhere, and the final episode makes the audience experience the same anxiety. Whether Tony actually dies in that restaurant remains deliberately unresolved, but the larger point is unmistakable. Tony's life has reached a stage where there is no such thing as a completely safe room anymore. The man wearing the members-only jacket in the final episode is one of the most analyzed details in The Sopranos. What makes the detail especially interesting is that the jacket is connected to an earlier episode, appropriately titled Members Only. In that episode, Eugene Pontecorvo wears a members-only jacket while struggling with his desire to escape the mafia. Eugene receives a large inheritance and believes that the money might finally allow him to leave New Jersey and start over in Florida. Tony refuses to give him permission, reminding him that he has already taken an oath to the organization. Eugene eventually becomes trapped between his criminal obligations and his desire for freedom, and his story ends tragically. Then in the final episode, a mysterious man wearing a members-only jacket appears inside Holsten's while Tony is sitting at the table. That doesn't prove the man is Tony's killer. The show never explicitly confirms it. But the visual connection is extremely deliberate, and it fits the larger pattern of the series repeatedly connecting Tony's fate with people who have already been killed or trapped by the same life. The jacket therefore works almost like a warning sign. Tony is surrounded by the consequences of the world he created, even when he doesn't recognize them. The legendary Barrens episode is often treated as one of the funniest episodes of The Sopranos, but there is something much darker underneath it. Paulie and Christopher become stranded in the New Jersey wilderness after attempting to deal with a Russian named Valerie. The episode slowly turns into a nightmare as they lose their way, run out of food, become increasingly paranoid, and begin fighting with each other. The strange thing is that the Russian's ultimate fate is never explained. He is shot, appears to be seriously injured, and then disappears. Paulie and Christopher search for him, but they never find his body. The show refuses to provide a conventional resolution. Many fans have interpreted the overhead shot of the forest as evidence that Valerie survived and climbed a tree. But David Chase and the filmmakers have explained that this was not intended as a literal shot of Valerie watching them from above. Chase has described the Russian as having a fairy tale quality, and the unresolved ending was intentional. That's why the episode feels so different from a normal gangster story. For once, Tony's crew enters a world where their usual rules don't work. There are no phones, no cars, no restaurants, no friendly neighborhoods, and no other gangsters to rescue them. They are simply two frightened men lost in the wilderness. The comedy comes from watching criminals who believe they control everything. Discover that nature doesn't care who they are. Christopher Moltisanti spends much of the series obsessed with becoming a writer and filmmaker, and eventually he produces his own horror movie, Cleaver. At first, this looks like another example of Christopher's ridiculous ambitions, but Cleaver is actually much more revealing than that. The film's story involves a powerful man whose relationship with a woman becomes complicated by another man who eventually seeks revenge. Christopher takes the emotional conflicts surrounding his own life and transforms them into a violent fantasy. The movie is therefore less about Hollywood than it is about Christopher's subconscious. He cannot openly tell Tony that he resents him. He cannot openly express his anger about Adriana. He cannot admit how much he wants independence from the organization. Instead, he creates a fictional story in which those emotions can exist without him having to acknowledge them directly. That's why Cleaver is so uncomfortable. Christopher thinks he's creating entertainment, but he's actually exposing himself. He turns his real frustrations into fiction because fiction is the only place where he feels safe enough to say what he really thinks. And Tony, who is intelligent enough to recognize what Christopher is doing, becomes increasingly suspicious of him. The movie within the show therefore becomes another piece of evidence in Christopher's gradual destruction. He thinks he is finally becoming independent, but he's actually revealing exactly how he feels about the people around him.